has China lost? And here I want to say very categorically that initially, in the initial phase after the Ukraine war, it's very clear that China has lost in the short term, and lost in actually 4 different ways. The first way in which China has lost is that, you know, the year 2022 is actually a very important year in China's political transition. There'll be a very important party congress in October, November this year, and the likelihood is that President Xi Jinping will get a 3rd term, and that's, as you know, unprecedented in recent times, and therefore that's a major political transition that's going to take place in China in October, November. And what President Xi wanted was a year of calm and stability in 2022. Instead, he's had to deal with 2, in a sense, major, I would call them almost like monsters of challenges. First is managing the exit out of the zero COVID policy, which is going to be a big challenge for China. And second, handling the ramifications of the Ukraine war. So in a year in which China wanted calm, is getting a tremendous amount of turbulence. And therefore, in that sense, the Ukraine war has been, you know, a challenge for China. And the second way in which China has lost out is that, as you know, as I explained, since both China and Russia are under pressure, they have developed a partnership, which is a natural thing to fend off the geopolitical pressures, the common geopolitical pressures that they feel. And it will be clearly in China's interest to see its partner, Russia, strengthen. Instead, and this is not a secret, Russia clearly has been weakened by the Ukraine war. We all know that when President Putin launched his invasion on February 24th, especially when he sent his tanks heading straight towards the capital, Kiev, I think he thought that I'm just going to launch a blitzkrieg operation, take over the capital city. The people of Ukraine will welcome the Russian troops and we will have a quick victory. I mean, he never said that that was his expectation, but that's what the behavior seemed to show. And as you know, it didn't work out. In fact, phase 1 of the Russian operation was a disaster, a real magnificent disaster. And at the end of the day, there was a rather ignominious retreat of the Russian tanks away from the capital city. And of course, there was a lot of celebration, exaltation in the West about this Russian defeat. And they thought, well, Ukraine's going to win the war. But I think the West, once again, has seriously underestimated Russian resolve. And clearly, the Russians are now going to carry on in an operation which I call a slow grinding operation to increase their space in Ukraine. And here it is conceivable that Russia can win in the long run. You'll have to wait and see. But in any case, clearly the war in Ukraine has proven to be a bigger challenge for Russia than Russia anticipated. Western sanctions have hit Russia. So Russia has been weakened. And with the weakening of Russia, this clearly is a setback for China too. That's the second way in which China has been negatively affected. The third way in which China has been negatively affected is that in trying to manage its rise, China has realized a long time ago, actually, and if you look at my book, Has China Won, I say even over 20 years ago, China anticipated a kind of some kind of American containment policy on China. And to try and ward off that containment policy, China did many things. But one of China's hopes was to try and deal with the United States and Europe as 2 separate entities with separate interests, and trying to make sure that the 2 didn't unite themselves against China. And for a long time, that was true. Europe actually had an independent policy towards China. In some areas, they agreed with the United States, but in other areas, for example, especially in trade, they stepped up their trade and connections with China. And China was more or less dealing with the United States and Europe separately, which is, of course, in China's interest. But then one of the most striking outcomes of the Ukraine war has been this remarkable coming together of the United States and Europe in a tremendous revitalization of Western solidarity. And now China has to deal with a strong united West rather than a divided West between the United States and Europe. And that is geopolitically, frankly, more uncomfortable for China. And as you know, the latest meeting between the European leaders and Chinese leaders proved to be difficult and fractious because the Europeans took the view that China should automatically support the European position on the Ukraine war, which of course was very unrealistic. So therefore, this revitalization of Western solidarity is also a setback for China. Of course, you have to wait and see how long this Western solidarity lasts, but we can talk about that later. And in the fourth way in which China has lost out from the Ukraine war is that for a long time, China thought that it had this incredible assets, its total reserves, which were about $3.2 trillion. Today, it's about $3 trillion of foreign reserves, which they saw as assets that they could use to protect China. And lo and behold, they were absolutely shocked to see how half of Russia's central bank reserves, out of 680 billion, I think 340 billion was seized by the West and frozen by the West. So clearly, now China sees that what is foreign reserves, which it saw as assets, could turn into liabilities if it could just be frozen overnight by the West and Western banks and so on and so forth. So this clearly has become a strategic, therefore, setback for China. And they are clearly now China must be thinking very hard, how do I protect myself from future Western sanctions, and how do I protect my reserves, and so on and so forth. So you can see on all these counts that I mentioned, the stability that President Xi wanted this year, the partnership with Russia, the unification of the West, and the vulnerability of the foreign assets that China has. In all these areas, China has lost out from the Ukraine war.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。